You're out. Don't come back. We're moving on without you." My mother's voice didn't shake when she said it, didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't carry even a trace of anger or hesitation. It was flat, rehearsed like she had practiced the sentence in front of a mirror until it sounded clean enough to deliver without feeling anything at all. The message was exactly 31 seconds long. I know because I replayed it twice, watching the timeline bar crawl from beginning to end, waiting for something else to appear, some explanation, some justification, a single word that might make it make sense. But there was nothing, just the verdict, final and complete, as if an entire lifetime of being her daughter could be erased. With the efficiency of a voicemail recorded at 9:47 on a Tuesday night. There hadn't been a fight before it, no warning, no tension building up in the days leading to it, nothing that would have prepared me for this kind of ending. 1 minute I was sitting cross-legged on my bed in my small studio apartment, laptop balanced on a pillow, finishing a risk assessment report for a client who didn't even know how close they were to losing everything, and the next minute my phone buzzed with a notification that quietly announced the collapse of my own life, delivered in my mother's voice, like it was just another task she had checked off her list. I remember staring at the screen for a few seconds before I pressed play, my thumb hovering just long enough for a strange thought to pass through my mind that maybe it wasn't what I thought it was. Maybe it was something normal, something small, something I could handle. But the moment her voice filled this room, that illusion disappeared, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like it had weight. I didn't cry. That's the part people always expect. The tears, the immediate breakdown, the visible reaction that proves something important has just been lost. But I didn't give them that, not then. I just listened once, then again, letting each word settle into place like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve but couldn't ignore. "You're out. Don't come back. We're moving on without you." It sounded less like a decision and more like an announcement, something that had already been agreed upon, finalized somewhere I hadn't been invited to, a meeting where my absence had probably been discussed more thoroughly than my presence ever was. I opened my messages instinctively, checking our family group chat, the one my younger sister had created 2 Christmases ago, the one that used to be filled with recipes, blurry photos, and small forgettable updates that somehow felt important at the time. And that's when I saw it. I wasn't muted. I wasn't archived. I was removed, completely gone. And the name of the chat had been changed too. It used to be the Owens family. Now it was just us. I stared at that word longer than I should have, trying to understand how something so small could feel so sharp, how a single word could redefine my entire place in a system I had spent years holding together. Us. Which meant I was now the opposite of that. I set my phone down on the nightstand, face down, like that would somehow quiet the echo of her voice still lingering in the room, and for a moment I just sat there, hands resting in my lap, listening to the faint sound of laughter coming from the apartment above me, a sitcom audience reacting to a joke that felt impossibly distant from the reality I had just stepped into. My first instinct was automatic, almost reflexive. Call her back, ask what I did wrong, apologize, even without knowing the reason. Promise to fix whatever needed fixing, because that was the pattern I had been trained to follow for as long as I could remember. Absorb the blame, smooth things over, keep the peace. My thumb hovered over her name in my contacts, the familiar pull of that role tugging at me, urging me to step back into it like I always had, but something stopped me this time. Maybe it was the tone of her voice, the way it lacked any real emotion, like this wasn't a reaction but a script. Or maybe it was the timing, the quiet realization that I had spent the entire day calculating mortgage payments for a house I paid for but barely belonged to. A house where my sister slept in the master bedroom while I took the couch whenever I visited, a house that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a transaction I had never agreed to fully understand. I lowered my hand slowly, the urge to call fading into something else, something quieter but stronger, and instead I opened our text thread and typed a single word, "okay." 5 letters, no explanation, no emotion, no resistance. Just okay. I added a period at the end. Stared at it for a second, then pressed send. The message delivered instantly, the small confirmation appearing beneath it, and then nothing. No typing indicator, no reply, no follow-up call. Just silence. And somehow that silence told me more than anything she could have said. She expected me to chase, to react, to fall back into the role I had always played. But when I didn't, when I gave her nothing but that one word, the script she had prepared no longer applied. I leaned back against the wall, exhaling slowly, and for the first time since the voicemail ended, I felt something shift inside me. Not sadness, not yet, that would come later in sharp, brief waves. I wouldn't fully understand until hours had passed, but something clearer, something colder. Awareness. The kind that doesn't ask for permission to exist. The kind that forces you to see things exactly as they are, instead of how you've convinced yourself they should be. I reached for my laptop again, not because I had to, but because I needed to do something with the energy building under my skin, something that felt familiar, controlled, logical. If my family had made a decision, then so would I, and this time it wouldn't be about keeping the peace. It would be about understanding exactly what had just happened and what it was going to cost them. Okay. It looked small on the screen, almost insignificant, just 4 letters, followed by a period, the kind of reply people send when they don't have the energy to argue, or the words to fight back, the kind of message that usually signals surrender, compliance, the quiet acceptance of whatever has just been decided for them. But that wasn't what it meant, not this time, not even close. When I pressed send, I wasn't agreeing with her, I wasn't accepting their version of events, and I definitely wasn't stepping out of my own life the way they expected me to. That word wasn't an ending, it was a line being drawn clean and deliberate, separating who I had been for them from who I was about to become without them. For a long time, I had been predictable, almost painfully so. If something broke, I fixed it. If someone needed help, I showed up. If there was tension, I absorbed it, reshaped it, smoothed it out, until everyone else could breathe again. I had built an identity around being reliable, the one who handled things, the one who didn't make scenes or demand explanations, the one who could be counted on to keep everything running, even when it cost me more than I could afford to give. And because I had done it so consistently for so many years, it had stopped being seen as a choice. It became an expectation, then a role, and eventually a function. I wasn't a daughter anymore, not really. I was infrastructure. Something stable. Something silent. Something that existed to support everything else without ever becoming the center of attention. An infrastructure doesn't get asked how it feels when it's removed. It just gets replaced. That was the part they got wrong. They thought that by cutting me out, they were removing a problem, simplifying their lives, clearing space for something easier, something that didn't push back or complicate their plans. They thought I would react the way I always had, with confusion, with guilt, with an immediate need to repair whatever I had supposedly broken. They thought okay meant I would circle back, call them, ask what I needed to do to fix things, offer more, give more, become smaller again so they could stay comfortable. But the moment I sent it, something shifted in a way I hadn't experienced before. It wasn't loud or dramatic. There was no sudden rush of emotion or clarity, just a quiet recalibration, like a system resetting itself after running the same flawed program for too long. I sat there in the dim light of my apartment, the glow of my laptop still illuminating the half-finished report on my screen, and for the first time I didn't feel the urge to chase after their approval or their acceptance. Instead, I felt distance. Not physical distance that had always been there, but something deeper, something internal, like I had finally stepped outside of a pattern I didn't even realize I was trapped in. I replayed the voicemail again, not because I needed to hear it, but because I wanted to listen differently this time. Not as a daughter trying to understand what she did wrong, but as someone analyzing a situation, looking for structure, for intent, for anything that didn't align. The tone, the wording, the lack of emotion, It didn't feel spontaneous, it didn't feel reactive, it felt planned. And that thought lingered longer than it should have. Planned meant this wasn't just about me. Planned meant there were steps taken before that message was recorded. Decisions made, actions set in motion that I hadn't seen because I hadn't been looking. That realization didn't scare me. It sharpened something. I closed the message, set my phone aside, and leaned back, staring at the ceiling as pieces began to rearrange themselves in my mind. If this was a decision, then it had a timeline. If it had a timeline, then it had a sequence. And if it had a sequence, then there were things I could trace, things I could verify, things I could understand in a way they clearly didn't expect me to. My breathing slowed, my thoughts became more structured, more deliberate, the emotional noise fading into the background as something else took over, something more familiar, more controlled. This was how I worked. This was what I did. I identified risks, patterns, inconsistencies. I found what people missed because they assumed no one was paying attention. And for years, when it came to my own family, I hadn't been paying attention, not in the way I should have. I had accepted everything at face value, trusted their intentions without question, filled in the gaps with explanations that made them look better and me feel necessary. But now we're sitting alone in that quiet apartment with nothing but a voicemail and a single word response hanging between us. I started to wonder what I would find if I stopped assuming and started looking. The idea didn't come all at once. It built gradually, threading itself through my thoughts until it felt less like a question and more like an inevitability. What if this wasn't about rejection? What if it was about removal? Not emotional removal, not the kind that happens after a fight or a falling out, but something more deliberate, something tied to things beyond feelings and family, dynamics. The thought was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, but it didn't go away. It stayed there just beneath the surface, waiting to be acknowledged. I sat up, pulled my laptop closer, and stared at the open screen without really seeing it, my mind already moving ahead of me, connecting things I hadn't fully articulated yet. If they wanted me out, truly out, then it wouldn't stop at a voicemail. It would show up elsewhere, in places I hadn't checked, in details I had overlooked. The shift from passive to active didn't feel like a decision. It felt like a correction, like something that should have happened a long time ago but didn't until now. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. And that was the difference. They couldn't see the difference hidden inside that one word, sitting in our message thread waiting to be misunderstood. Okay, not surrender, not acceptance. Just the quiet beginning of something they hadn't planned for, something they hadn't accounted for, something that was already moving forward while they still believed I was standing still. I didn't plan to calculate it that night, not in full, not down to the last dollar, but once the idea entered my head, it wouldn't leave, and the only way I knew how to deal with something that felt too big to process was to break it into pieces, to make it measurable, trackable, real. So I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it Family Financial Obligations, my fingers moving almost automatically across the keyboard as if this were just another client file, another risk assessment, another case where the numbers would tell a story people didn't want to hear. Column A item, column B monthly amount, column C duration, column D total. Clean, simple, objective. At least that's what I told myself before I started filling it in. The first line was the mortgage, the house they called the family home, the one I had co-signed for the one I had been paying for every single month without fail, $1,850. 36 months, $66,600. I paused for a second after entering it, not because I didn't know the number, but because seeing it laid out like that, stripped of context, stripped of justification, made it feel heavier than it ever had before. I kept going. Health insurance for my parents, $640 a month, 2.5 years, $19,200. I had set that up when my father's back went out and they couldn't afford coverage anymore, told myself it was temporary, just until things stabilized, just until they figured something out. Except temporary had stretched quietly into years without a single conversation about ending it. Next line, Brooke's car loan, the white SUV she posted on social media, with captions about independence and fresh starts. $380 a month, 14 months, $5, 320. I remembered the day she called, her voice, bright and excited, talking about how this was her step into adulthood, how she just needed a little help to make it happen. And I remembered saying yes, without asking what she had saved. Without asking what she could contribute, because I already knew how that conversation would go if I pushed back. Then came the irregular expenses, the ones that never had a schedule, but always arrived with urgency, always framed as one-time emergencies that somehow never stopped repeating themselves. My dad's surgery, co-pay the roof repair before winter, the dental bill that had gone to collections because my mom forgot to mention it earlier, Brooke's security deposit when she moved out, then moved back, then moved out again. Each one had a story attached to it, a reason, a justification that made it feel necessary in the moment, but stripped of those explanations, reduced to numbers on a screen. They started to look different, less like isolated incidents, and more like a pattern I had never fully acknowledged. I kept typing, my eyes moving between documents, bank statements, old emails I had saved without thinking I would ever need them. My own records becoming evidence against a narrative I had believed for years. By the time I reached the bottom of the sheet, the cursor blinking in the final cell, I hesitated for a moment before entering the formula, as if delaying it would somehow change the outcome, but I pressed enter anyway and the number appeared. Instantly, $143, 214. I stared at it, waiting for it to feel unreal, waiting for my brain to reject it as a mistake, but it didn't. It sat there solid and undeniable. A total that represented not just money, but time, energy, opportunity, every small decision I had made to prioritize them over myself, without ever stopping to question whether it was sustainable or fair. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of that number pressing against something deeper than logic, something that had been building quietly over the years without ever being named. I thought about what that amount could have been if it had stayed with me: student loans, paid off savings bill, a down payment on my own place, a buffer that might have allowed me to breathe instead of constantly calculating what I could afford to give next. Instead, it had gone into a system that had just removed me without explanation, as if my contributions were invisible the moment they were no longer convenient. And the worst part wasn't even the money. It was the realization that not once, not in all those years, had anyone acknowledged it in a way that felt real. There were no thank yous, no moments where someone paused and said, "We couldn't have done this without you." No recognition that what I was giving wasn't just extra, it was essential. It had been absorbed, normalized, expected, until it became the baseline, something they relied on so completely that they forgot it came from me at all. I scrolled back up through the spreadsheet, reading each line again this time, not as data but as a timeline of choices I had made under pressure, under expectation, under a belief that this was what family meant, and maybe it was for them. For me, it was starting to look like something else entirely, something transactional, something imbalanced, something I had been funding without ever signing a contract that defined the terms. I opened the folder where I kept supporting documents, pulling up the mortgage agreement, the insurance policies, the loan confirmations, each file a reminder that my name was attached to more than just the payments. It was embedded in the structure of their lives in ways I hadn't fully considered before. I wasn't just helping, I was sustaining. And the moment that thought settled into place, the number at the bottom of the spreadsheet shifted again, not in value but in meaning. It wasn't just what I had given, it was what they stood to lose. Up until that moment, I had always thought of what I was doing as help support, stepping in where I was needed, filling gaps the way any responsible daughter would. But as I sat there staring at the documents spread across my screen, something became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a series of favors. It was a system, and I wasn't just part of it. I was the center of it, the piece. Everything else depended on whether anyone said it out loud or not. The more I looked, the clearer it became. The mortgage wasn't just a monthly payment. I contributed to it, was a legal structure, with my name embedded in it, co-signer, co-owner, the person whose credit had made the entire purchase possible in the first place. Without me, there was no loan approval, no house, no family home for them to live in and decorate and post about as if it had materialized out of thin air. The bank didn't trust them, it trusted me. My income, my credit history, my consistency, and that trust was the only reason the deal had ever gone through. Then there was the joint account, the one I had set up to simplify everything, to make bill payments seamless, efficient, organized a system where my money flowed in and their expenses flowed out, a quiet pipeline that kept everything running, without friction, without delays, without questions. It had felt practical at the time, even generous, a way to reduce stress for everyone involved. But now, looking at it with a different lens, it looked less like convenience and more like control. Except the control wasn't mine. It was built on my contributions, but structured in a way that allowed them to operate as if those contributions were guaranteed, automatic, permanent. And then there was the trust, the one my grandmother had set up, the one she had placed entirely in my hands, naming me as the sole trustee because she believed I would manage it responsibly, because she trusted me to make decisions based on logic, on fairness, on the actual terms she had outlined. $86,000 designated for education and medical needs, not for impulsive ventures or convenience, not for smoothing over poor planning or avoiding accountability. That money didn't move without my approval, without my signature, without me actively choosing to release it, and suddenly, that responsibility, the one I had carried quietly, without thinking too much about its implications, took on a different weight. Every major financial thread in their lives ran through me in some form or another. The house, the account, the trust, the insurance, the loans, the emergency payments, the invisible infrastructure that kept everything stable, everything predictable, everything functioning. And yet, somehow they had made a decision to remove me as if I were optional, as if I were a piece they could simply take out without consequence, as if the system would continue to operate exactly the same way once I was gone. That was the part that didn't add up. It wasn't just emotional anymore, it was structural, logical, almost mechanical. If you remove the foundation of something, it doesn't stay standing out of politeness. It collapses. Not immediately, not always dramatically, but inevitably. I leaned forward, opening more documents, tracing connections I hadn't fully mapped out before, following the flow of money, the legal ties, the dependencies that had formed over time without ever being explicitly acknowledged. The mortgage payment came from my account. The insurance policies were tied to my billing information. The trust required my authorization. Even the smaller things, the recurring expenses, the utilities, the subscriptions, all linked back to me in ways that were easy to overlook when everything was working smoothly but impossible to ignore. Once I started paying attention, I wasn't just supporting them, I was sustaining the entire structure. And the moment that realization settled in, something shifted again, not emotionally this time, but strategically. Because if I was the one holding everything together, then I was also the one who could let it fall apart. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but out of simple cause and effect. Remove the input and the output changes. Stop the flow and the system stalls. It was basic, almost obvious, once I allowed myself to see it clearly, and yet it was something they had either overlooked or assumed I would never act on. They thought they could separate me from the family while still benefiting from everything I provided, as if those two things existed independently of each other. They thought they could keep the structure without the foundation. I sat back, exhaling slowly, letting that understanding settle into something solid, something I could actually use. This wasn't about arguing, about convincing them to see my side, about trying to repair a relationship that had just been severed without warning. This was about reality, about what existed on paper, in contracts, in systems that didn't care about emotions or narratives, only about signatures, payments, authorizations. And in that world, the one I understood better than anything else, I wasn't powerless. I was central. The irony of it didn't escape me. For years, I had been told directly and indirectly that I was the strong one, the reliable one, the one who could handle things, and I had accepted that role without questioning what it actually meant, without recognizing the leverage it gave to me. Strength had been framed as endurance, as the ability to carry more without breaking, but now it looked different. Now it looked like control, like the ability to decide what I would and wouldn't continue to support, like the option to step back and let the consequences unfold naturally. I glanced at my phone, still face down on the nightstand, silent since I sent that one-word reply, and for the first time since the voicemail, I felt something close to clarity. They had made their move clean, final, decisive. But they had made it based on an incomplete understanding of the system they were trying to manipulate. They saw me as a person they could remove. They didn't see me as the structure they depended on. And that miscalculation, more than anything else, was where everything was about to change. If I'm honest, none of what happened that night started with the voicemail. It started years earlier, in a kitchen that always smelled faintly of detergent and overcooked food, and small moments that didn't seem important at the time, but quietly shaped everything that came after, moments that taught me who I was supposed to be, long before I ever had the chance to decide for myself. I was 14 the first time I understood the difference between what my sister was allowed to have and what I was expected to become. It was the beginning of summer, the kind of afternoon where the air feels heavy and slow, and my parents sat us down at the dining table to explain the plan for the next few weeks. Brooke was going to art camp 4 weeks, $300, something they described as an opportunity, something she deserved, something that would help her explore her creativity. I remember nodding, smiling even, because that's what I did. I reacted the way they needed me to react. But when I asked carefully if I could go to the math program at the community college, the free one I had already qualified for, the one that didn't cost anything except time, my mother didn't hesitate. When she said no, "Someone has to be here for your sister," she told me, like it was obvious, like it was already decided. Like my role had been assigned long before I ever opened my mouth. I tried to explain that the program was free, that it wouldn't cost them anything, that I could manage both if they just gave me a chance. But she cut me off with a sentence I would hear in different forms for years after that. "You're the older one, you understand." And I did understand, just not in the way she meant. I understood that Brooke got experiences and I got responsibilities. That her growth was something to invest in, while mine was something to redirect, something to shape into usefulness rather than possibility. That pattern didn't announce itself as unfair, not at first. It just repeated quietly over and over until it became normal. When I brought home good grades, they were expected, acknowledged with a quick nod or a distracted comment about keeping it up, never celebrated, never framed as something worth pausing for. While Brooke's struggles were met with comfort, with attention, with long conversations about how she was more than her mistakes. I remember sitting in my room once, listening through the wall as my mother reassured her after a bad test, her voice soft and patient, in a way I had never heard directed at me. And I remember realizing that being strong didn't mean being valued, it meant being overlooked, because you didn't require immediate care. Strength became a reason not to be seen. And I adapted to that the way kids do when they're trying to make sense of a system they don't control. I learned to need less, to ask for less, to solve my own problems before they became visible, because visibility didn't lead to support. It led to redirection, to being reminded that someone else needed more, that someone else came first. Brooke didn't have to learn those things. She moved through our childhood with a different kind of gravity. one that pulled attention toward her instead of away from her, one that allowed her to exist without constantly calculating how much space she was taking up. It wasn't her fault, not entirely. She was responding to the environment the same way I was, just from a different position within it. But the difference between us became more pronounced with every passing year. When I got my first part-time job, it was framed as a step toward independence, a way to start building something for myself. But within weeks, that narrative shifted. The money I earned, quietly absorbed into the household, redirected toward needs that always seemed more urgent than anything I might have wanted for myself. When Brooke needed something, it was presented as temporary, as support, as something she would eventually grow out of. But when I contributed, it was treated as a natural extension of who I was, not something that required acknowledgement or gratitude. I wasn't helping, I was fulfilling a role. And roles once established are hard to step out of, especially when they're reinforced by the people you're trying to stay connected to. By the time I left for college, the dynamic was already fully formed. I was the one who handled things, who managed, who absorbed pressure without pushing back. And Brooke was the one who needed, who struggled, who required attention in ways that justified the imbalance. Even when I tried to express how overwhelming it felt, how the weight of everything was starting to affect me, the response was always the same, delivered in slightly different words, but carrying the same message: you're strong, you can handle it, your sister needs more right now. Those words settled into me, slowly shaping the way I saw myself, the way I measured my worth, the way I justified the decisions I made later, the money I sent, the sacrifices I didn't question until much later. Because if you're the strong one, then needing something feels like failure, and asking for it feels like betrayal. So I didn't ask. I adapted. I became exactly what they needed me to be: reliable, consistent, available, someone who could be counted on to keep things running even when it cost me more than it should have. And for a long time that felt like love, like loyalty, like doing the right thing. It took years and a voicemail that erased me in 31 seconds to see it for what it actually was: a pattern of imbalance, so deeply ingrained that it didn't even need to be explained anymore, just executed again and again until there was nothing left of me that existed outside of what I could provide. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. It crept in quietly, somewhere between my first paycheck and the 100th transfer I sent without thinking twice, until one day I realized I wasn't just helping anymore. I was expected to provide, to fill gaps that kept appearing, as if my presence in their lives had been redefined into something transactional, something that ran on a schedule whether I acknowledged it or not. I still remember the day my first real paycheck hit my account, the sense of pride that came with it, the feeling that I had finally stepped into something of my own, something I had earned through years of effort and discipline. And for a few hours, I let myself enjoy it, let myself imagine what it would mean to build a life that didn't revolve around constant obligation. That lasted exactly 4 hours. My mom called that evening, her voice already carrying that familiar tone, not quite urgency, not quite desperation, but something that sat in between, something that made it difficult to say no without feeling like I was abandoning them. My dad had thrown out his back at work. She explained there were medical bills, immediate costs, and no coverage to fall back on. And before she even finished the sentence, I was already opening my banking app, already calculating how much I could send without completely draining myself, already stepping into the role that had been waiting for me the moment I became financially capable. $2,000. Sent that night. No hesitation, no conditions, no conversation about repayment, because that wasn't how this worked. It was always framed as temporary, as something that would only happen this once, just until things stabilized, just until they got back on their feet. But this once had a way of repeating itself in different forms, different amounts, different reasons, until it stopped feeling like an exception and started feeling like the rule. A few weeks later, it was Brooke, needing a security deposit for her first apartment, talking about independence, and fresh starts in a way that sounded convincing enough to make me believe it might actually be different this time. I asked a question I shouldn't have, a simple one, whether she had any savings, whether she had contributed anything toward this step. She was so eager to take, and the silence that followed told me everything I needed to know before my mom's voice cut in sharp and immediate, reminding me that Brooke was just starting out, that family supports each other, that I should know better than to make things harder for her. So I sent the money, $1,200, just like that. And it kept going. Small amounts, large amounts, irregular amounts that always came with the same framing, always urgent, always necessary, always positioned in a way that made refusal feel like cruelty rather than self-preservation. Meanwhile, my own obligations, my own financial reality, stayed in the background, unacknowledged, untouched, as if they didn't exist because I never spoke about them. My student loans sat there accumulating interest, a quiet reminder of a future I was postponing while I funded a present that didn't belong to me. I never received a message asking how I was managing, whether I needed help, whether I was keeping up, because in their version of the story I didn't need anything. I was the one who handled things. That identity became so embedded that it erased the possibility of me existing outside of it. When I sent money, there was no acknowledgement beyond a quick confirmation that it had been received, no gratitude that felt genuine, no pause to recognize what it represented, not just the amount but the effort behind it, the hours worked, choices made to prioritize them over myself. It was absorbed seamlessly, like it had always been theirs. I flew home one Thanksgiving after months of working overtime, my savings thinner than I was comfortable admitting, and sat at a table filled with food I had indirectly paid for, listening to conversations that moved around me as if I were just another background element, present but not central, included but not really seen. No one mentioned the money. No one connected the dots between my contributions and the stability they were experiencing. It was as if the system ran on its own, as if the support I provided had become invisible the moment it became consistent, and the imbalance didn't stop there. Birthdays came and went, milestones passed without acknowledgement. Small moments that might have signaled appreciation never materialized, replaced instead by more requests, more needs, more expectations that I would continue to show up in the appreciation. Same way without question. There was a month not long after that Thanksgiving, when my account dropped lower than I had ever let it go, before a combination of rent bills and another round of transfers that left me calculating how to stretch what was left until the next paycheck arrived. I remember standing in my kitchen looking at the limited options I had, making quiet adjustments, cutting back in ways that felt temporary but weren't telling myself it was fine, that I could handle it, that it would balance out eventually. I didn't tell them. I didn't say anything about the strain, about the way the numbers were starting to tighten around me, because I already knew how that conversation would end, with reassurance that I was strong, that I would figure it out, that Brooke needed support right now. That phrase again, like a loop that never broke. And maybe that was the part that shifted everything in hindsight, the realization that there was no version of this where I was prioritized, no scenario where my needs would be placed alongside theirs in a way that felt equal. I wasn't part of the equation in the same way they were. I was the solution they turned to when something didn't add up. And solutions don't get thanked. They get used, applied, relied on until they're no longer available. By the time I saw it clearly, it wasn't a single moment of clarity. It was a collection of them layered over years of quiet acceptance, forming a picture that was impossible to ignore once I allowed myself to step back and look at it without the filters I had been using to justify it all. I hadn't just been supporting my family. I had been funding a system that depended on me staying exactly where I was doing, exactly what I had always done, without ever asking what it was costing me in return. It stopped feeling like a family situation the moment I laid everything out, in order, not emotionally, but chronologically, Because emotions can be messy, subjective, easy to dismiss, but timelines don't lie. They either align or they don't. And once I started placing each piece exactly where it belonged, the pattern became impossible to ignore. The voicemail wasn't the beginning, it was the final step, the clean and controlled execution of something that had already been set in motion days earlier. I went back to the joint account first, the one I had set up to manage everything efficiently, and that's where the first crack appeared. The contact email had been changed. Not updated, not corrected, replaced. My email was gone, and in its place was Brooks. The timestamp sat there quietly, almost insignificant, if you weren't paying attention 2 days before the voicemail. 2 days. I stared at that detail longer than I expected to, letting it settle, letting it connect to everything else I had already started to suspect. That wasn't a reaction. That was preparation. I didn't confront it, didn't call, didn't ask. I just kept digging because if there was one change, there were probably more. My inbox became the next piece of the puzzle, buried under routine work emails and automated notifications, but once I filtered through the noise, I found it, a forwarded message from the title company, handling the house, something I had skimmed past earlier, without fully registering what it meant. The subject line was neutral, almost boring, beneficiary amendment confirmation pending. It didn't sound urgent, didn't sound threatening, but when I opened the attachment, the air in the room shifted in a way I couldn't explain immediately. The document was standard, structured, formatted exactly the way it should be. Nothing about it screamed fraud or manipulation at first glance, which was probably the point. At the bottom, there were 2 signature lines. One for my mother, primary owner, one for me, co-owner, both signed. I leaned closer to the screen, zooming in, studying the details the way I would in any other situation, separating what looked right from what felt wrong. The slant was similar, the spacing consistent. Even the way the letters connected was close enough that someone unfamiliar with my handwriting wouldn't question it. But I knew my own signature. I knew the habits built from years of signing documents quickly, the small shortcuts my hand took without thinking. And there it was, the mistake, the capital O in my last name. I always left it slightly open, a loop that never fully closed. This one was sealed complete, just a fraction off, but enough to turn suspicion into certainty. Someone had taken the time to study how I wrote my name, to replicate it, to place it on a document designed to remove me from something I legally owned. I checked the submission details next, my eyes moving faster, now connecting pieces before I could fully process them. Submitted electronically. By Brooke. Listed as authorized family representative. Authorized by who? Not me, not ever. And the date, 3 days before the voicemail. That's when everything locked into place. First, the document was prepared and submitted with a forged signature to remove me from the deed. Then the contact email on the joint account was changed to redirect control and communication. Then, only after those pieces were in motion, the voicemail was sent clean and final, removing me from the family itself. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't an emotional fallout. It was a sequence. Step 1, isolate the financial structure. Step 2, alter access and control. Step 3, eliminate the person tied to both so she doesn't interfere while the changes finalize. I sat back slowly, letting the full weight of that timeline settle in, not as a feeling but as a conclusion. They hadn't pushed me away because something broke between us. They had removed me because I was in the way of something they wanted to take full control over. The voicemail wasn't the cause, it was the cover. A distraction, designed to keep me focused on the emotional impact, while the real actions happened somewhere else, in documents, in systems, in places they assumed I wouldn't check because I would be too busy reacting, too busy trying to tame Starly, but understand what I had done wrong. And for a moment I almost admired the structure of it, the precision, the way each step led into the next without overlap or hesitation. almost, because the one thing they hadn't accounted for was how I worked, how my mind defaulted to patterns, to inconsistencies, to anything that didn't align perfectly. They had planned it well, but not well enough. I opened more files, cross-checking dates, verifying details, building the timeline out further, each new piece reinforcing the same conclusion. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't miscommunication. It was intentional, deliberate, controlled. And suddenly the entire situation shifted from something emotional into something else entirely. Something colder, sharper, something that didn't rely on feelings or explanations, but on facts, on evidence, on actions that could be traced and proven. The room felt quieter than before, not empty, but focused, like everything unnecessary had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. I glanced at my phone again, still silent, still face down, and for the first time since all of this started, I didn't feel confused or hurt or even angry. I felt alert. Because if they were willing to plan this, to execute it step by step without hesitation, then whatever came next wouldn't be accidental either. And that meant I couldn't afford to react the way they expected me to. I had to move differently, think differently. Because this wasn't just a family situation anymore. It was a strategy. And now that I could see the pattern, I knew one thing for certain. They weren't the only ones capable of making a plan. I didn't gasp when I saw it, didn't slam the laptop shut or reach for my phone in a rush of disbelief, because the moment didn't arrive like a shock. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, the way truth does when it's been hiding. In plain sight, just long enough for you to finally recognize it for what it is. I zoomed in on the signature again, narrowing my focus until the rest of the document blurred into the background, reducing everything down to a single line of ink that was supposed to represent me, my consent, my agreement to step away from something I had built and sustained for years. At first glance it worked. That was the unsettling part. It worked well enough to pass, well enough to move through whatever system had processed it, without raising immediate concern, well enough that someone who didn't know me, who didn't know how my hand moved across a page, would have accepted it without hesitation. The slant was right, slightly forward, the spacing consistent, the letters connected in a way that suggested familiarity rather than hesitation. Whoever did this didn't rush. They studied, they practiced, they paid attention to the details that make a signature feel natural instead of forced. But a signature isn't just how it looks, it's how it's formed, the habits embedded in muscle memory, the small inconsistencies that repeat themselves so often they become invisible to anyone but the person who created them. And that's where it broke. My eyes moved to the capital O in Owens, the point where my hand always curves but never closes completely. A habit I picked up years ago when I started signing documents quickly, leaving a slight gap in the loop as my pen moved on to the next letter. It's not something I think about, it just happens every time, consistently enough that I've never had to question it. This one was different. The loop was closed, neat, almost too perfect, like someone had been more concerned with making it look complete than making it look real. It was a small detail, the kind most people would miss entirely, but to me it stood out immediately. A flaw in an otherwise careful imitation, the one place where the performance slipped just enough to reveal what it actually was. I leaned back slightly. Not to distance myself from the screen, but to take in the full context again, to see the signature as part of the document instead of in isolation, to understand what it was being used for. A beneficiary amendment, a request to remove me from the deed of a property I co-owned. Submitted electronically. Approved pending confirmation. My name placed there without my knowledge, without my consent, acting as a key to unlock something I had never agreed to give up. The realization didn't hit all at once. It layered itself piece by piece, each detail reinforcing the next, until there was no space left for doubt. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding or a clerical error or a miscommunication that could be explained away with a phone call and an apology. Someone had intentionally forged my signature, replicated it well enough to pass through initial checks, and used it to try to remove me from a legal structure that directly tied me to the house, to the mortgage, to everything I had been financially responsible for. And there was only one person who had both the access and the motive to do it: Brooke. I didn't say her name out loud, didn't need to. It sat there in my mind with a clarity that felt almost clinical, stripped of the emotional weight it should have carried, reduced to a simple conclusion based on evidence rather than feeling. But the absence of immediate emotion didn't mean it wasn't there. It just meant it was delayed, building beneath the surface in a way that was harder to ignore because it wasn't explosive. It was controlled, focused, directed. I thought back to the call from 2 months earlier, the one I had dismissed at the time, as another attempt to persuade me into stepping back into making things easier for everyone. I just need you out of the trust and off the deed. The words replayed in my head now with a different tone, not casual, not careless, but intentional, like a statement of goal rather than a suggestion. She had told me exactly what she wanted, and when I didn't give it to her, she found another way to take it. That was the moment the narrative shifted completely. Up until then, there had been room, however small, for interpretation for the possibility that this was a breakdown, a series of poor decisions driven by emotion or misunderstanding. But this removed that space entirely. Forgery isn't emotional, it's calculated. It requires time, effort, a willingness to cross a line that can't be uncrossed once it's been stepped over. I leaned forward again, opening the original mortgage documents, pulling up my actual signature from when I had signed as co-owner, placing it side by side with the forged version, comparing them not just visually but structurally, looking at pressure points, stroke order, the way the pen would have moved to create each line. The differences became more obvious the longer I looked, small inconsistencies that added up to something undeniable. The tail on the N was slightly longer in mine, the spacing between letters more compressed, the rhythm of the signature more fluid, less deliberate. This version was careful in a way mine never was, precise in a way that suggested observation rather than instinct. It wasn't me, and the moment that certainty settled in fully, something else followed, something heavier, harder to process, because it wasn't about the document anymore. It was about what it represented. Betrayal is a word people use easily, often without fully considering what it means, but in that moment it felt accurate in a way that didn't leave room for exaggeration. This wasn't just someone going behind my back or making a decision without including me. This was someone actively working against me, using my identity as a tool to remove me from something I had every right to be part of. I closed the document slowly, not because I needed to stop looking at it, but because I had seen enough. The evidence was there. The conclusion was clear. And whatever came next wasn't going to be about figuring out what happened. That part was done. It was going to be about what I chose to do with it. I didn't need to look far for the one thing they didn't know I had, because it had been sitting quietly on my phone the entire time, filed away under routine, labeled without urgency, treated as just another habit I'd built from years of managing conversations that might matter later, but now with everything else laid out in front of me, it stopped being a habit and started becoming leverage. I opened the recording app, slowly scrolling through the list until I found it, the call from 2 months ago, the one I had almost forgotten about because at the time, it didn't seem important enough to revisit. Just Brooke, being Brooke, softening her tone, circling around what she wanted without asking directly, the way she always did when she knew she was stepping into territory I wouldn't immediately agree to. The file name was automatic time-stamped, nothing special about it, but as soon as I tapped it and the audio loaded, something shifted, not externally, but internally, like a switch, flipping from reaction to control. I put in my earbuds not because I needed privacy, but because I wanted to hear every detail without distraction, every pause, every inflection, every small variation in her voice that I hadn't paid attention to the first time. The call started normally casual, almost warm, the kind of tone that suggested reconciliation, like she was reaching out to fix something that had been off between us. She asked about my work, about my apartment, about things she had never really cared about before, and at the time I had taken it at face value. Let myself believe that maybe this was a shift. Maybe we were moving into a different kind of relationship where things felt more balanced, more equal. Now listening again, it sounded different. The warmth wasn't genuine, it was strategic, a setup, a way to lower resistance before introducing the real topic. I let it play without interrupting, my attention narrowing as the conversation moved closer to the part that mattered. There was a moment about halfway through where her tone changed slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that I noticed it now, a subtle tightening, a shift from casual to intentional. She started talking about how busy I was, how much I had on my plate, how stressful it must be to manage everything on my own, framing it as concern, as empathy, but underneath it, there was something else, something more calculated. Then she said it. I just need you out of the trust and off the deed. The sentence landed differently this time, heavier, clearer, stripped of the context I had originally given it, to make it seem less direct, less deliberate. Need, not want. Not think it might help. Need. She wasn't suggesting a possibility, she was stating an objective. I paused the recording, letting that word sit in the silence, replaying it in my head before I rewound a few seconds and listened again, just to be certain I hadn't misheard it. The clarity of it cut through everything else, aligning perfectly with the timeline I had already built, the document. I had already analyzed the signature I knew wasn't mine. She had told me exactly what she intended to do, openly, casually, assuming I wouldn't recognize it for what it was or that I wouldn't do anything about it if I did. And when I didn't agree, when I didn't step aside the way she expected, she moved forward anyway, replacing consent with imitation, replacing conversation with action. I let the recording continue, listening to the rest of the call with a level of focus I hadn't applied the first time, noticing the way she framed things, the way she positioned my removal as something beneficial for me, something that would relieve me of responsibility, as if the entire situation was designed to make my life easier rather than theirs. It was subtle, effective in its own way, but now that I understood the intent behind it, it felt transparent, almost predictable. When the call ended, I didn't remove my earbuds right away. I just sat there, the silence that followed, feeling different from the silence after the voicemail, less empty, more defined, like it was holding something rather than taking something away. Because for the first time since all of this started, I wasn't just reacting to what had been done to me. I had something that shifted the balance, something that moved me out of the position they had placed me in and into one they hadn't anticipated. Evidence. Not suspicion, not interpretation, not something that relied on how I felt or what I believed, but something concrete, something recorded, something that captured intent in a way that couldn't be easily explained away. I saved the file again, not because it wasn't already stored, but because I wanted to be certain duplicating it, backing it up in multiple places. Cloud external drive, email, each copy a safeguard against the one thing I knew from experience had a way of happening when things became inconvenient for the people involved. Information disappears, records get lost, narratives get rewritten. But this was fixed, preserved exactly as it had been said, exactly as it had been meant. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting to the documents still open on my screen, the forged signature, the timeline, the financial structure, all of it forming a complete picture. Now no gaps left to fill, no questions left unanswered. They had made their move carefully, deliberately, assuming they controlled the narrative, assuming I would respond within the boundaries they had set. But they hadn't accounted for this, for the one piece. They couldn't see the one detail that shifted everything from a situation they could manage to one they couldn't fully contain. I picked up my phone again, glancing at the message thread where my single-word reply still sat unanswered, unchanged, and for a moment I considered what it must look like from their side. Silence, where they expected reaction, compliance, where they expected resistance, a lack of movement that probably reassured them they were still in control. I let that thought settle not as something to correct, but as something to use. Because the power in this moment wasn't in confronting them immediately, wasn't in revealing what I knew or forcing a reaction before I was ready. It was in timing, in choosing when and how this information would surface, in deciding the moment when their plan would stop being invisible and start becoming something they had to answer for. And as I sat there with everything finally aligned, one thing became clear in a way it hadn't before. I wasn't behind anymore. I was waiting. By the time I walked into the attorney's office, I wasn't looking for comfort or validation. I was looking for clarity, for structure, for a way to translate everything I had uncovered into something actionable, something that could hold its weight outside of my own understanding. And the moment I placed the folder on her desk, I could feel the shift from personal to procedural, from something that lived in emotions to something that existed in facts. Janet Aldridge didn't react with surprise or sympathy. She moved through the documents with the kind of precision that comes from seeing variations of the same story too many times, to count her eyes scanning each page, each signature, each timestamp, connecting pieces without needing them explained. I watched her carefully, not because I needed to read her expression, but because I wanted to understand what she saw when she looked at the same evidence I had spent hours dissecting. When she finally looked up, she didn't start with what I expected. She didn't say this was terrible, or ask how I felt, or question why my family would do something like this. She said very simply, "You have leverage." The word landed differently than I thought it would, heavier, more grounded, like it carried implications I hadn't fully considered yet. She pointed to the forged document, first explaining in clear, measured terms that what had been done wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. That forging a signature on a property document wasn't a minor issue or something that could be smoothed over with an apology. It was a serious offense with consequences that extended far beyond family conflict. Then she moved to the mortgage, the deed, the trust, laying out the structure in a way that made it even clearer than before. Nothing moved without me. Not legally, not permanently, not without my actual signature. The one thing they had tried to replicate, but couldn't truly replace. And then she said something that reframed everything in a single sentence. If you stop participating, the entire system pauses. Not collapses immediately, not explodes into chaos overnight, but stalls, freezes, becomes unworkable until you decide otherwise. I sat with that for a moment, letting it settle into something solid, something I could hold on to, because up until then, control had always felt abstract, something I didn't fully believe I had even when the evidence suggested otherwise. Now it felt defined, measurable, real. We talked through options next, not in terms of revenge, but in terms of consequence, what each action would trigger, what each decision would set in motion. I could file a formal complaint about the forged signature, initiate a legal process that would force accountability in a way they couldn't ignore or dismiss. I could block the refinance, preventing any changes to the property until the situation was resolved. I could freeze access to the trust, ensuring that not a single dollar moved without my explicit approval. Each option carried weight, not just legally, but strategically, each one, a step that shifted the balance further in my direction. But the most powerful option wasn't the most aggressive one. It was the simplest: do nothing. At least nothing immediate. Let their plan continue under the assumption that it was working. Let them move forward with incomplete information. Let them believe they had already removed me from the equation. Because the moment they relied on that assumption, the moment they acted on it, was the moment the consequences would be most visible. I left her office with more than just a plan. I left with a framework, a way to approach what came next without falling back into old patterns, without reacting emotionally or prematurely. Back in my apartment, I set everything out. Again, the documents, the recording, the timeline. But this time, I wasn't analyzing, I was deciding. The first step was immediate and quiet. I logged into the joint account and changed the permissions. Not dramatically, not in a way that would trigger an alert, but enough to ensure that nothing further could be altered without my awareness. Then I drafted a notice to the title company, not sending it yet, just preparing it, outlining the discrepancy in the signature, requesting a review that would, when submitted, halt any pending changes until the issue was resolved. I opened the trust documents next, reviewing the terms one more time, confirming what I already knew. Control rested with me fully legally, without ambiguity. I didn't need to act on it yet. Knowing it was enough. The recording stayed where it was backed up untouched, waiting for the moment it would matter most. And that was the part that changed everything. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. Every step, every decision, every delay was intentional, part of a sequence they hadn't planned for, because it didn't follow the pattern they expected me to repeat. I glanced at my phone again, still silent, still holding that single word I had sent days ago, and for the first time I allowed myself to imagine what the next conversation would look like, not from a place of defense, but from a position of control. They would reach out eventually, they always did, when something didn't go according to plan. When a system they relied on stopped responding the way it should, and when they did, the dynamic would be different, not because I had changed who I was, but because I had finally stepped out of the role they had assigned me and into something else entirely. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand anything, or prove a point through confrontation. The facts would do that for me. The structure would do that for me. The consequences would do that for me. I closed my laptop slowly, the room settling into a quiet that felt earned rather than empty. And as I leaned back, one thought stayed with me, clear and steady. They had tried to remove me like I was a problem to be solved. They forgot I was the system holding everything together. And systems don't disappear quietly when you try to cut them out. They respond.